it's nice to be with you again. Today we're going to go off in a little different angle than what we've been talking about, and we're going to explore looking at the international market and if this is something your company should consider, and if so, what do you do about it? So let's start in and take a look at what we've got going on here. Today we hear constantly about how we are involved in a global world, and what happens here affects countries and people all over the globe, and what happens there affects us as well. And that's absolutely true, and it holds more so for businesses. There is a huge ripple effect. What goes on in one country definitely affects what goes on in another. And so we're going to start taking a look at what these effects can be. One thing that we're going to look at is world trade. You know, as you probably know, the trade between different countries is just increasing exponentially. It's a huge issue. But what may surprise you is that counter trade still accounts for about 25% of the world trade. Now, what counter trade is when we exchange products, not currency. So instead of paying with cash for a product, we'll go with different governments or different communities and exchange a product for another product. And this goes back to the old barter systems that we used to use before the countries became industrialized. You know, where I would share my wheat with you if you'd share your chicken with me. And this still goes on. It's still a viable means of doing business in today's world marketplace. We also need to look at the market conditions. Some of the things we would consider that we're not going to explore in detail here is currency exchange rates, you know, how the economy over there affects the economy over here, etc. The value of our dollar, what that dollar can buy in the United States or elsewhere, is dependent on the value of the yen, of the euro dollar, of everything else. So those are the types of things that we would want to consider. Something else we want to look at are some of the roadblocks that are in place when dealing with other countries. Not all countries are interested in doing business with us. Not all countries want that to occur, and for many times good reasons. One of those is protectionism, where they want to protect their country and their country's industries. If they start bringing in products and allow a lot of products from other countries in, then it could damage and hurt their domestic industries. So in order to protect their economy, their industries, there's different strategies they use. One of them is import quotas. And import quotas means only a certain number of product is going to be allowed into the country. This is usually, again, to protect an economy, to make sure that an industry, especially that's struggling, isn't going to be damaged by imports from foreign countries. We also have embargoes. And embargoes are very similar to the import quotas, except they're usually done for a different reason. Embargoes don't limit the amount of product coming in. They don't allow the product, usually from a specific country. For example, we don't allow products, the U.S. does not allow products in from Cuba. Okay? These embargoes are usually not to protect domestic industry. Embargoes are usually more of a political issue. It may have to do with human rights, it may have to do with a number of things, but it's more of a political decision rather than an economic one. Tariffs is a term that you may be familiar with. We kind of look at tariffs as being a type of tax, but it's the amount of money that is charged to bring your product in. So in other words, if you want to bring a product into my country, I may charge you a tariff. It's an extra fee that you need to pay in order to do that. Tariffs are definitely a barrier. However, there's also something called non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers might be, for example, very strict product specifications. For example, if you want to bring your product into my country, it can only be made a certain way, and it has to have certain things about it. That doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, the problem is they don't always have to tell you what those specifications are. And I've heard of companies who've had to submit products for approval 10, 15, once even 32 times before it was finally allowed in. because all they would hear back is, no, it does not meet our specifications. But nobody ever explained what those specifications were. Okay, GATT stands for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Okay, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, this agreement has been around for a long, long time, has many member countries, and it gives some guidances on doing international business. It kind of sets what kind of tariffs are appropriate, what's too much, what's a good amount. And it also puts some trade restrictions. One of them that we'll be talking about in a few moments is something called dumping, and we'll get into that more later. The last of these roadblocks I wanted to talk about was WTO. It stands for World Trade Organization, and you may be very familiar with that. There's been a number of times the World Trade Organization has been in the news. It can be a very controversial organization. But the purpose of the organization is to be like a referee. When there are problems dealing with international business and international trade, they're kind of giving the guidelines on what's right and what should happen and what shouldn't. Not every country agrees with that definition. And that's where a lot of the controversy comes into. But if you look at this, there's a lot of problems, a lot of hurdles to go over to do business in another country. So why do we have to pay attention to it? Obviously, if we want to grow and we really want to expand, international business is where it's going to happen. Okay? Because most industries in the United States are saturated. There's not a lot of growth opportunities out there. So if you want substantial growth, you're probably going to have to go international. But what if you say, you know what, I'm going to retire in a few years. I want to open my own little bookstore on the corner somewhere and just retire, and I'm not interested in making huge profits or expanding internationally or anything like that. Why should I care about this? Well, in terms of daily monitoring, you probably don't have to. But you still need to keep current because your competitors are going to have international ties. Your suppliers are going to have international ties. Your customers are going to request things that will require some international dialogues going on. It's almost impossible to find any type of business where there's not some international connection, even if it's not doing direct business with another country. Okay, so let's start looking at the environment and the different economic communities that are out there. There are many economic communities. We're going to talk about some of the most well-known. The first, of course, is the European Union, the EU. And since I don't know when you're viewing this tape, I don't know how many member unions or member countries there are. At the time of this taping, I believe we were up at 20. The goal of the European Union was to get rid of the barriers to trade between the member countries, going with a common currency, common paperwork, trying to standardize as much as possible so that trade can exist more freely between those member countries. Now, the barriers are still high around the union, so getting in to do business with them is still challenging. But for the member countries, there's a definite benefit there. One that the United States is involved in is the North American Free Trade Agreement, better known as NAFTA. NAFTA has 3 member countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It was not fully implemented by the due date, and it still is not. It was the first agreement that contained provisions for protecting the environment. No other trade agreement had conducted that before. So while it's a very worthy and a good goal, it's been very hard to implement. Okay, there's a lot of problems and a lot of controversies with doing this. Some of the controversy is the worry that American jobs are going to go to Mexico because the labor's cheaper there. Okay, that may pan out to be true or not. In some industries it seems to have more of an effect than others. But another type of problem, for example, that came about that was totally unexpected was the fact that by lessening the requirements at the border and allowing more trade, Mexican trucks would come across the border ready to go, no problem, and then they'd have to stop because the trucks from Mexico did not meet our EPA guidelines. And according towards our provision for protecting the environment, they need to do that. And so we had a lot of distribution issues here. The trucks can come in, but they can't go anywhere. And these were the kinds of problems that we're running across in implementing NAFTA to its full degree. Now, one that you may or may not be familiar with is one that's actually in the development stage. Again, there's quite a bit of controversy involved. It's called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And it's all the American countries, North, Central, and South America. And the controversy really rises around the fact that the United States is going to be a superpower in there. And our wealth and everything is going to give us more say as opposed to equal say among all the member countries. There's a lot more specific issues that you're free to look up at your leisure. Okay, now let's go and look at the environments. We discussed environments last time. We're just going to look at some of the international implications of the environment. Okay, in terms of the economic, two figures that are commonly quoted are the GDP, gross domestic product, and the GNP, the gross national product. And these are good figures to give you an idea of what's going on in a country, but they're not specific enough for marketing purposes. They're an overall figure, and they don't tell you much about the distribution of income. They don't tell you if this country has a very small but very, very rich upper class, no middle class, and then a large lower class or poor group. It doesn't tell you if there is a huge middle class. It doesn't give you an idea for the actual people and the distribution of that wealth. So what we tend to look at more in making our strategy is the economic infrastructure. We want to look at things such as the distribution systems that are in place, the transportation systems, and the communication systems. As Americans, we have gotten to the point where we rely on these. We take these for granted. And usually when we talk about technology, we think, do they have the computers we need? Do they have access to the internet like we need? Well, in a number of countries, they don't have the rail system for transporting the product that we need. They don't have the infrastructure, the highway systems that we need. Those things are extremely vital and things we need to consider. We also want to look at the level of development of each country. Again, this is discussed in your textbook, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But we need to look at the country. Is it a developing country, least developed country? Is it already a developed country? And the reason it's important to look at this is it tells you what kind of products they need and they're looking for. Are they more agricultural based? Are they more service based? It kind of gives us a feel for that. But it also tells us more about their standard of living, what their expectations are, what kind of quality they want. Now I want to make a comment about that, about quality. We assume, being Americans, that the highest quality is usually the best. But that's not always the case. People don't always want high quality. They would rather have a lower but safe quality if it means a lot lower in price. So this is one of the things we have to look at. Can we still give them something that will satisfy their needs at a price they can afford? And that's part of the standard of living. Looking at the political and legal environment can be very tricky because this is going to change immensely with the different administrations in office in the United States and in the various countries. Just a couple things to point out, though, is one risk we want to find out if it really exists, if it's something we need to consider, is are we at risk for nationalization or expropriation? Now what this means is the government of a country takes over any facilities within their borders. In the case of nationalization, they will pay the company for that facility. Now, they're not going to pay it what it's worth. That's just not going to happen. But they will give them some reimbursement for it. But they take it over. They say, it's in our borders, it's ours, we now own it. With expropriation, there is no reimbursement. They say, it's ours, we take it over, go away. We're not giving you a penny. Now, in today's society, in doing so would probably be considered an act of war. So for a country to do that, they have another agenda that they're trying to pursue. And we want to evaluate that before we move into a country. Is this a risk that exists for us there? We also want to make aware of local content rules. Part of this goes back to those product specifications that I mentioned earlier. But sometimes countries do not want a certain type of ingredient. They do not want a product from other countries involved in there, or they want a certain amount of the component parts of a product made from their own country. So for example, they may be importing this product from, say, the United States, but they want at least 60% of the products, of the component parts inside that product, to be made from their country or sourced elsewhere. Okay, and they have the right to set out those specifications. So that is something that we want to make sure we know before we put any kind of investment into this country. Probably the hardest one to deal with is the cultural environment. And the types of things we're going to be looking at are listed up there. We want to look at the values. We talked about that briefly last time. We want to look at any kind of symbols and superstitions. For example, let's say you get invited over to somebody's house for dinner in another country. And being a good little American, you take a housewarming gift with you. That's appropriate. You need to do that. And you find this beautiful arrangement of 3 white lilies. They're just gorgeous. And so you take that and give that to the hostess. Depending on the country you're in, you just wish death upon that family and their home. Okay, what they symbolize and the superstitions that are attached to that are very important, and it's so easy to make a mistake. In some countries you do not cross your legs because to show anybody the bottoms of your feet is extremely disrespectful. To use your left hand is disrespectful. How are you going to know this? You've really got to study. You've got to have somebody there to help you with this. This is not something that you're just going to pick up and it's going to be easy to learn. Obviously, language can be a real issue. Not only are there different languages, but there's different dialects, hundreds and hundreds of different dialects. In the United States, we experience that all the time. And so many mistakes have been made in advertising and in other business decisions because they didn't take the time to look at the language properly. The last thing I have listed there under cultural environment is ethnocentrism. And that is the tendency to buy products from your own country. We see that in the United States during times of military action or sometimes during Olympics where there'll be a strong Buy American push. And that's the idea behind ethnocentrism. With Americans, it tends to be a cyclical, short-lived tendency. In other countries, it's a very strong feeling where they do not want to buy American products or other countries' products. They want to buy products from their own country. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the things we need to look at and evaluate before we move into a country. Once we've decided we need to do this, how do we actually get in there? That's what we're going to look at here in looking at our specific strategies, starting with entry methods. There are more entry methods than what we're going to cover, but these are the most common. Exporting, before I go through that, let me say we're going through these in order from the least risky to the most risky. Okay, so starting out with exporting, which is the method that has the least risk associated with it. Exporting is when we're based in our domestic country, our home country, and we ship our product to other countries. This is very common, especially now with the internet, where we can base all our activities here at home and we ship it to other countries. We may use an export agent who handles that for us, the actual movement of the product. That's a possibility. But the risk is minimal because all you can really lose is a shipment. There's not going to be any long-term consequences. You may not have the benefits that you do with some of these other methods, though. You may have missed opportunities. Because when you're exporting only, you usually don't tailor your strategy, your product, your promotions to a specific region. And therefore, you might be missing out on some really significant opportunity. Our second entry method is contractual agreements. This means we have a contract with other companies, and I have some methods listed there. Licensing and franchising are very similar. Licensing is when we contract the right for other companies to use our name. For example, we may start up a Napa store. Okay. Well, we are licensing out our name. We're allowing other companies to use it. Franchising is very similar, but it's more comprehensive. Franchising means not only are we selling our name, but we're also allowing you to use our resources, our method of operations. When you see restaurants, for example, expanding internationally, many times, it's through franchising. They'll get a local partner there who signs a contract, usually long-term, 20, 30 years, and says, okay, we are going to take the Kentucky Fried Chicken from U.S. and we're going to open it in this country instead. And that's a real good way for companies to expand internationally because, number one, it allows them to do it fast without a lot of investment on their part. But two, the franchisee, the one who's buying the franchise and opening the store in the other country, has the advantage of being from that country usually. They're able to make the cultural adaptations that are necessary and the product changes that are necessary to make that product a success. Okay, a joint venture is when two companies join together and form a third company. And this is a very common means of going international. It's especially a good way for American companies to go into the EU, European Union. We'd like to take advantage of that EU, but we're on the outside. We're outside that barrier. However, if we join together with a company from a member country, we can take advantage of some of those opportunities. Now, a strategic alliance is a joint venture. It's the same thing, except the two companies involved in a strategic alliance are normally competitors. For example, two car manufacturers might join together to make a new model. That would be a strategic alliance. The final entry method is the direct investment. And direct investment means we are taking our money and we are opening our own plant, our own store. It's all owned by us. We're not sharing it with anybody. We own it, we run it, it's all ours. There is a lot of risk involved with that, but we don't have to share the payoff with anybody. It is our profit to make as well. Okay, so those are the entry methods. The last level, or last types of decision we're going to look at is the marketing decisions. We've kind of set up the situation. Now what do we do about it? What kind of thoughts do we need to make? Well, let's look at the marketing mix. One of the decisions we'll have to make before we get into the specific areas of the 4 Ps is, do we want to go with a standardization strategy or a localization? With a standardization strategy, we're going to use basically the same strategy in all countries that we operate. We will have to make some adaptations. Obviously, language would be one of them. But the same basic strategy is going to be used everywhere. This is also called a globalization strategy many times. In a strategy that is more localized, we will come up with a unique strategy for each of the target markets. If you have a company that is so large it's basically everywhere in the world, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Okay. For example, Coca-Cola uses a standardized strategy. It makes its modifications as it needs to, but it uses one basic strategy. Okay, so now let's take a look at those 4 Ps. The product decisions we're going to be making is looking at the product that we're offering and seeing, does it fit that culture? For example, an air conditioner company was going into Japan. Their product was good, the people liked their product, no problem. But what they found out is the fans were too big and noisy for the Japanese people, where people live in closer proximity to each other, and so they hear the neighbor's air conditioner a lot more than we do. And so they had to redesign the fan so that it would fit that culture. In pricing decisions, we have a couple areas that we need to look at. One is called something called a gray market. A gray market is not illegal. But what a gray market is when unauthorized dealers are selling a product. Okay, unauthorized dealers. This is one way that prices are cut to the customer's advantage, but not to the company's advantage. For example, IBM may sell their product through authorized dealers. However, somebody in one country may buy it by a large quantity, and they get this big discount, and then they turn around and sell it to other people at a lower price than the authorized dealers. They're not authorized to sell it. They're not supposed to sell it. However, this happens pretty often. It's not uncommon by any means, and again, it's called the gray market. The other thing I wanted to refer to is dumping, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about GATT and WTO. Dumping is when you sell a product at a lower price in a foreign country than you do at home. And why this may be an advantage, you think, to the people who live in that other country, here they are getting this great product, hopefully, at a lower price. The downside to that is if you're selling it at this lower price, you're probably undercutting their domestic industry and damaging their economy. So dumping is something that is illegal, and there are huge penalties if it is discovered. In terms of distribution, again, you have to look at the culture. There are some countries, Italy, for example, Germany, who are very restrictive as to what type of companies can come in, how big they can be, who can own them. Walmart has experienced quite a bit of trouble in different countries getting access to the people. And then finally, promotional decisions. This is the area where we have the most problems. Research isn't done enough. We assume that we know what's best, and we go in there and make bad decisions. There are tons of examples out there, tons. But one example, which I think is a classic, Gerber baby food. Great product. They decided to sell their product in some South African countries that had a very low literacy rate. They took their product as is and put it on the shelves and had real problems. Why? Well, if the literacy rate is low, that means you can't read the labels. So how do you know what the product is? By looking at the picture. What picture is on the Gerber baby food label? A baby. They thought this was ground up babies. Very easy to fix. You change the picture to a mother feeding a baby, and the problem's solved. But it's a big, big mistake that they made on that one. Okay, in summary then, businesses who embrace global strategies will be best prepared for today's and tomorrow's marketplace. It's going to help you, again, with your suppliers, with your competitors, even if you aren't involved in international sales yourself. Arrogance and confidence will not bode well for an organization. Always procure local help. Do not assume you can pick up what you need to know on your own. Hire somebody from that culture. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a great day.